Its magnificent architecture, sprawling territories, and cultural achievements casts a long shadow across history. Yet beneath the marble facades and tales of conquest lies a truth that many prefer to forget. The Roman Empire was built on the backs of millions of enslaved human beings whose suffering formed the foundation of one of history's most celebrated civilizations. This is not a story of triumph, but of systematic dehumanization that touched every corner of Roman society. In the heart of the empire, where senators debated philosophy and poets crafted verses, enslaved individuals endured conditions that challenge our comprehension of human cruelty. The Roman system of slavery was not merely an economic institution. It was a comprehensive structure of domination that stripped individuals of their humanity, reduced them to property, and normalized violence on an industrial scale. To understand Rome is to confront this darkness, to acknowledge that what we admire from a distance was purchased with immeasurable human suffering. The enslaved population of Rome comprised perhaps 30 to 40% of Italy's inhabitants during the empire's height. These were not abstract numbers, but millions of individual lives. Men, women, and children torn from their homes, separated from families, and thrust into a world where their bodies, labor, and very existence belonged to others. Among the most vulnerable were the young, particularly boys captured in war or born into bondage, who faced unique and devastating forms of exploitation. Roman law classified enslaved people as res, things, not persons. This legal framework enabled and encouraged treatment that ranged from casual brutality to systematic torture. The 12 Tables, Rome's foundational legal code, granted masters absolute power over their human property, including the right to kill without legal consequence. This was not aberrant behavior, but institutionalized cruelty, woven into the fabric of Roman civilization. The markets where human beings were sold operated openly in every major Roman city. In these spaces, people were examined like livestock, their teeth checked, muscles prodded, and bodies exposed for inspection. Young captives, particularly those from recent military campaigns, commanded high prices. Dealers specialized in different types of enslaved people, some focusing on laborers, others on educated Greeks for tutoring, and disturbingly, some on young boys and girls selected for their appearance. Historical accounts from writers like Seneca, Pliny, and Juvenal provide glimpses into this world, though often filtered through the perspective of the enslaving class. These sources, while valuable, require careful analysis to extract the experiences of the enslaved themselves. Archaeological evidence, including shackles, punishment collars, and the remains found in slave quarters, offers additional testimony to the physical realities of bondage. The transformation of a free person into property began with capture or sale, but the process of breaking human will continued long after. New captives faced immediate violence designed to crush resistance and demonstrate the totality of their powerlessness. This initial trauma was calculated and deliberate, intended to create compliant bodies that would serve without question. For young boys entering this system, the shock was particularly severe, as they were torn from everything familiar and thrust into a world of absolute subordination. Understanding Roman slavery requires confronting uncomfortable truths about how societies can normalize extreme violence and exploitation. The Romans did not see themselves as uniquely cruel. Rather, they viewed slavery as natural and necessary, a perspective reinforced by philosophers, laws, and social customs. This normalization of atrocity offers disturbing insights into how oppressive systems sustain themselves through ideological justification and the complicity of those who benefit from them. The Roman slave system operated with mechanical efficiency, processing human beings through established channels that transformed free individuals into property. War provided the primary source of enslaved people, with entire populations sometimes enslaved following military victories. Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars alone reportedly resulted in hundreds of thousands enslaved, while the Jewish War under Vespasian saw similar numbers torn from their homeland. These mass enslavements flooded Roman markets with human merchandise. Pirates and raiders supplemented military captures, particularly in frontier regions where organized kidnapping operations thrived. Coastal communities lived in constant fear of slave raids, with young people being prime targets due to their higher market value and longer potential years of service. The Mediterranean Sea, rather than serving as a barrier, became a highway for human trafficking that connected diverse regions in a web of exploitation. Debt slavery trapped many within the empire's own borders, as impoverished citizens sold themselves or family members to survive economic hardship. Parents faced the devastating choice of watching children starve or surrendering them to slavery. Roman law permitted fathers to sell children up to 3 times, a provision that reveals the casual cruelty embedded in legal frameworks. These domestic sources of enslavement meant that slavery was not merely imposed on foreign others, but threatened Romans themselves. Birth into slavery condemned countless children to bondage from their first breath. The principle of partus sequitur ventrem, that children follow the condition of their mother, ensured a self-perpetuating supply of enslaved people. Wealthy households often encouraged or forced reproduction among their enslaved population, viewing children born into bondage as investments that required no initial purchase price. These children, knowing no other life, were often considered more reliable and manageable than those who remembered freedom. The slave markets themselves were carefully organized commercial enterprises. Major markets operated in Delos, Ephesus, and Rome itself, with specialized areas for different categories of human property. Dealers, known as mangones, developed expertise in presenting their merchandise appealingly, using cosmetics to hide illness, training captives in desirable skills, and creating fictional backstories to increase value. The island of Delos reportedly processed up to 10,000 enslaved people daily at its peak, demonstrating the massive scale of this trade. Young boys faced particular scrutiny in these markets, with buyers examining them for physical beauty, perceived intelligence, and potential for various forms of service. Those deemed attractive might be purchased for household service in wealthy homes, where proximity to power brought its own dangers. Others were selected for specialized training as scribes, musicians, or attendants. The evaluation process itself was dehumanizing, reducing children to a collection of attributes and potential uses. Transportation from point of capture to final destination often proved lethal. Enslaved people were marched hundreds of miles in chains, packed into shipholds with minimal food and water, or carted like cargo across vast distances. Mortality rates during transport were high, particularly for the young and weak. Those who survived arrived at their destinations physically and psychologically broken, prepared for the next phase of their commodification. The economic value of enslaved people created a paradox within the system. While they were legally things rather than persons, their human capacity for labor, skill development, and even emotional connection to masters made them valuable in ways that inanimate property could never be. This tension between the legal fiction of slavery and the human reality of the enslaved created spaces for both extreme exploitation and occasional, limited recognition of humanity, though always within the fundamental framework of ownership and domination. Within Roman households, slavery took on intimate dimensions that differed markedly from agricultural or industrial bondage. Wealthy Roman homes, or domus, contained dozens or even hundreds of enslaved people performing specialized roles that brought them into constant contact with their owners. This proximity created complex dynamics of dependence, control, and abuse that shaped daily life for both enslavers and enslaved. The household became a microcosm of Roman power structures, where absolute authority manifested in personal, immediate ways. The familia urbana, the household slave community, operated under rigid hierarchies that mirrored and reinforced broader Roman social structures. At the top stood the villicus or major domo, often an enslaved man who managed other enslaved people on behalf of the master. Below him, specialized roles proliferated: cooks, servers, cleaners, doorkeepers, secretaries, teachers, nurses, and personal attendants. Each position carried different levels of privilege and vulnerability, creating divisions among the enslaved that masters deliberately cultivated to prevent solidarity. Young boys entering household service faced immediate categorization based on appearance, perceived abilities, and the master's intentions for them. Those deemed intellectually promising might be assigned to the pedagogium, a training system within wealthy households where enslaved children learned skills ranging from literacy to specialized crafts. However, this education came at a price: total submission to the master's will and acceptance of their own status. The promise of skill development often masked more sinister purposes. The role of deliciae, or pet slaves, represents one of the most disturbing aspects of Roman household slavery. These were typically young boys, chosen for their beauty and charm, kept as living ornaments and companions to their masters. Historical sources describe how these children were dressed in fine clothes, taught entertaining tricks, and displayed at social gatherings as symbols of wealth and power. Seneca wrote disapprovingly of masters who kept such pets, noting how they were infantilized and prevented from normal development to maintain their appeal. Physical proximity to masters meant constant vulnerability to violence and sexual abuse. Roman law provided no protection against rape or assault by owners, as enslaved people were considered extensions of their master's will rather than individuals with rights. The bedroom slave, or cubicularius, who slept near or in the master's chamber, faced particular exposure to abuse. Historical accounts and archaeological evidence, including explicit artwork and graffiti from Pompeii, document the sexual exploitation that was routine and socially accepted. Punishment within households ranged from casual slaps to elaborate tortures designed to terrorize entire slave communities. The ergastulum, a private prison found in many wealthy homes, housed enslaved people deemed troublesome or rebellious. Here, individuals could be chained, beaten, or subjected to various torments without any external oversight. The sounds of punishment served as warnings to others, creating an atmosphere of perpetual fear that ensured compliance. The peculium system, which allowed enslaved people to accumulate property with their master's permission, created additional complications in household dynamics. Some enslaved individuals managed to save enough to purchase their freedom, or even to own enslaved people themselves. This possibility of manumission, however remote, became a tool of control, encouraging compliance and pitting enslaved people against each other in competition for favor. Young boys who showed promise might be tantalized with future freedom as a means of ensuring present cooperation. Female members of the household, both free and enslaved, played complex roles in perpetuating or occasionally mitigating the system's cruelties. Matronae, the mistresses of households, often directed the labor of enslaved women and children with their own forms of violence and control. Yet historical accounts also record instances of protection or favoritism, though these acts of relative kindness occurred within and reinforced the fundamental structure of ownership. The relationships between enslaved children and the free children they served as companions or nurses created additional layers of complexity that would shape Roman society across generations. Beyond the households of the wealthy, millions of enslaved people labored in conditions that treated human beings as disposable resources. The mines, quarries, and agricultural estates of the Roman Empire consumed lives with relentless efficiency. Young boys, despite their size, were not spared from these killing fields of labor. Their small bodies were seen as advantageous for certain tasks, crawling through narrow mine shafts, nimble work in workshops, or serving as runners and messengers across vast agricultural operations. The latifundia, massive agricultural estates that dominated the Italian countryside and provinces, operated on scales that prefigured industrial agriculture. These enterprises required enormous workforces to maintain productivity, with enslaved people vastly outnumbering free workers. Boys as young as 7 or 8 were integrated into these operations, beginning with lighter tasks, but quickly graduating to back-breaking labor as their bodies developed. The goal was maximum extraction of value during their productive years. With little concern for long-term health or survival, mining operations represented the nadir of Roman slavery, where life expectancy could be measured in months rather than years. The silver mines of Spain, the gold mines of Dacia, and the marble quarries of Greece devoured human lives to feed Rome's appetite for wealth and grandeur. Young boys were particularly valued in mines for their ability to navigate narrow passages and their nimble fingers useful for sorting ore. The conditions underground, darkness, toxic fumes, constant cave-in danger and brutal overseers, created a living death that ancient writers acknowledged as the worst fate possible for an enslaved person. Chain gangs worked the fields during planting and harvest, with boys incorporated into these groups despite their lesser strength. Chained at the ankles and sometimes at the neck, they moved in synchronized misery across the landscape, visible reminders of Rome's agricultural wealth's true cost. The columnist Columella wrote detailed instructions for managing agricultural slaves, recommending isolation, minimal food, and constant work as means of preventing rebellion. His matter-of-fact tone reveals how normalized this systematic cruelty had become. Urban industries presented different but equally harsh realities. Bakeries, fulleries, laundries, and workshops operated around the clock, with enslaved workers laboring in shifts that allowed no rest for machinery or infrastructure. Boys working in fulleries spent their days treading human urine used in the cleaning process, developing chemical burns and respiratory problems that shortened already brief lives. Those in bakeries faced extreme heat, flour dust that destroyed lungs, and the constant danger of industrial accidents with no medical care. The construction projects that created Rome's architectural marvels demanded enormous human sacrifice. The Colosseum, the aqueducts, the great roads, all were built with enslaved labor working under conditions where death and maiming were routine. Young boys carried materials, mixed mortar, and performed countless support tasks that freed adult workers for heavier labor. Falls from scaffolding, crushing injuries from stone blocks, and exhaustion-related deaths were so common that work sites maintained disposal procedures for bodies as part of routine operations. Seasonal variations in labor demands meant that enslaved people, including children, faced periods of extreme overwork, followed by deliberate undernourishment during slower times. This cyclical exhaustion prevented recovery and ensured that most agricultural slaves aged rapidly, their bodies breaking down under relentless strain. Masters calculated the cost-effectiveness of working slaves to death versus maintaining them, often concluding that replacement was cheaper than preservation. The ergastula, the barracks where agricultural slaves were housed, were designed for security rather than human welfare. Archaeological excavations have revealed these structures, windowless, poorly ventilated, with sleeping platforms rather than beds, and heavy chains embedded in walls. Boys housed in these conditions faced not only the daily exhaustion of labor, but also the nighttime dangers of violence from overseers and other enslaved people, disease from overcrowding, and the psychological trauma of complete powerlessness. The sounds of these places, chains clanking, coughs from damaged lungs, cries of pain or despair, created a soundscape of suffering that characterized much of rural Italy. The Roman appetite for entertainment created particularly cruel dimensions of slavery, where human suffering became spectacle and young bodies were conscripted into performances that ranged from artistic to fatal. The entertainment industry of Rome, encompassing gladiatorial games, theater, music, and dance, relied heavily on enslaved performers whose training began in childhood. These boys faced a paradox. They might achieve fame and even wealth while remaining property, their bodies and talents owned by others who profited from their display. Gladiatorial schools, or ludi, acquired boys through various channels. Some purchased specifically for training, others condemned to the arena as punishment, and many simply born to gladiator parents. Training began as young as 10, with boys learning weaponry, combat techniques, and the theatrical elements that transformed violence into entertainment. The regime was brutal. Insufficient food to maintain hunger and aggression, constant physical conditioning, and regular beatings to inure them to pain. Those who survived to fight in the arena faced death rates approaching 20% per appearance in their early careers. The venations, wild beast hunts staged in amphitheaters, employed young boys in various capacities that exposed them to lethal danger. Some served as bait or distractions, using their agility to evade animals while entertaining crowds. Others worked behind the scenes, caring for and transporting dangerous animals, facing daily risk of mauling or death. The spectacle demanded constant novelty, leading to increasingly elaborate and dangerous scenarios that consumed young lives for momentary entertainment. Theatre and performance created different but equally exploitative conditions. Boy actors, particularly those playing female roles before women were permitted on stage, faced intense training regimes that began in early childhood. They learned not just lines but songs, dances, and acrobatic routines that required years of preparation. The most successful might achieve celebrity status, yet remained property, their earnings belonging to masters. Behind the glamour, sexual exploitation was endemic, with young performers expected to provide private entertainment to wealthy patrons. Musical training represented a significant investment, with masters purchasing young boys specifically for their potential as singers or instrumentalists. The Romans particularly valued young voices, and some sources suggest that castration was occasionally practiced to preserve boyish vocal qualities, though this was less systematic than in later periods. These young musicians performed at private parties, religious ceremonies, and public events, their talents adding cultural refinement to Roman society while they themselves remained enslaved. The gymnasiums and wrestling schools where young enslaved boys trained for athletic competitions operated under the guise of physical education, but often served as venues for sexual exploitation. The Greek tradition of pederasty, while formerly discouraged in Rome, found expression in these settings where powerful men could observe and select young bodies under the pretense of athletic appreciation. Boys trained as wrestlers or runners might find themselves purchased for reasons having nothing to do with their athletic abilities. Prostitution, both within formal brothels and informal arrangements, entrapped countless enslaved boys in cycles of sexual exploitation. The lupanaria, brothels of Pompeii and other cities, contain evidence of child prostitution, including graffiti and architectural features designed for controlling and displaying young bodies. Boys used in this manner faced not only rape and violence, but also disease, drug addiction. Wine and opium were used to maintain compliance, and psychological destruction that few survived intact. Public executions and torture demonstrations sometimes featured young enslaved people as victims, their suffering choreographed for maximum crowd impact. The damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts, might include boys accused of crimes or simply chosen to add pathos to the spectacle. These deaths were staged as elaborate productions, with costumes, narratives, and special effects that transformed judicial murder into entertainment. The crowds that cheered these spectacles included children themselves, free Romans, learning to view enslaved suffering as acceptable amusement. The permanent physical damage inflicted through entertainment slavery marked survivors for life. Gladiators bore scars that told stories of survival. Actors and dancers suffered chronic injuries from years of performance, and those used in sexual entertainment carried psychological wounds that no manumission could heal. Even those who achieved fame, and perhaps eventual freedom, remained marked by their origins, their bodies testimony to Rome's transformation of human suffering into spectacle and profit. Religion in Rome intertwined with slavery in ways that sanctified exploitation, while occasionally offering enslaved people limited spaces for dignity and community. Temples owned vast numbers of enslaved people who maintained sacred spaces, assisted in rituals, and sometimes served as offerings themselves. Young boys face particular vulnerability in religious contexts, where sacred authority combined with secular power to create conditions of absolute control, masked by divine mandate. Temple slavery operated on massive scales, with major religious institutions owning hundreds or thousands of enslaved people. These sacred slaves, or hieroguli, performed functions ranging from maintenance and cooking to participation in religious ceremonies. Boys served as assistants to priests, carried sacred objects in processions, and maintained eternal flames in temples. Their labor sustained the religious infrastructure that Romans believed maintained divine favor for the empire. Yet they themselves remained property, denied the spiritual benefits their work supposedly generated. Mystery cults, which proliferated throughout the empire, often incorporated enslaved people in ways that blurred lines between religious participation and exploitation. The cults of Cybele, Isis, and Mithras included enslaved adherents who might achieve religious status while remaining legally owned. Young boys initiated into these cults faced intense ritual experiences, fasting, flagellation, mock death, and rebirth ceremonies that served to break down individual identity and create absolute loyalty to both cult and master. The practice of sacred prostitution, while debated by historians, appears to have existed in certain temples, particularly those dedicated to Eastern deities. Young boys and girls were dedicated to temples where they served religious functions that included sexual availability to worshippers. This exploitation was framed as sacred service, their bodies becoming conduits for divine communion. The psychological impact of such framing, where rape was reconceptualized as religious duty, created particular forms of trauma that compounded the basic violence of enslavement. Sacrificial practices occasionally included human victims, though this became rare in the classical period. However, the threat of being selected for sacrifice remained a tool of terror, particularly for young enslaved people who might be chosen for their perceived purity or beauty. Even when actual human sacrifice ceased, symbolic deaths in religious dramas and ceremonies placed enslaved boys in positions of extreme vulnerability, where the line between representation and reality could shift based on crowd mood or priestly whim. The Roman household religion, centered on the Lares and Penates, incorporated enslaved people in daily rituals that reinforced their subordinate status. Young boys might be responsible for maintaining household shrines, making daily offerings, and participating in family religious ceremonies where they were simultaneously essential and excluded. They enacted rituals that blessed the family that owned them, invoking divine protection for their oppressors while remaining outside the spiritual community these rituals created. Funerary practices revealed the ultimate religious exclusion of enslaved people. While wealthy Romans built elaborate tombs and conducted complex burial rituals to ensure favorable afterlives, enslaved people were often disposed of in mass graves or dumped in designated areas outside city walls. Young boys who died in slavery faced not just mortal death, but spiritual annihilation, denied the rights that Romans believed necessary for peace in the afterlife. This religious violence extended beyond death, condemning enslaved children to eternal unrest. Some religious movements offered enslaved people alternative spiritual communities. Early Christianity's message of spiritual equality attracted many enslaved converts, though the religion's early leaders, including Paul, ultimately reinforced earthly slavery while promising heavenly freedom. The appeal of these messages to enslaved youth reveals their desperate need for hope and dignity in a system designed to deny both. Yet even these alternative religions operated within and often accommodated the slave system, offering comfort without challenging the fundamental structures of oppression. The use of enslaved boys in religious education created complex dynamics where they might achieve significant learning while remaining property. Some became experts in religious law, mythology, and ritual practice, serving as teachers to free Roman children. This education, however, served their masters' purposes, creating learned slaves whose knowledge increased their value while their legal status remained unchanged. The tragedy of brilliant minds trapped in owned bodies represents one of slavery's many intellectual crimes, where human potential was simultaneously cultivated and constrained by the system that claimed ownership over both body and mind. Despite the overwhelming power arrayed against them, enslaved people, including young boys, found ways to resist their oppression. This resistance took many forms, from daily acts of defiance to organized rebellions that shook the empire. Understanding these acts of resistance reveals the unbroken human spirit that persisted despite systematic attempts at dehumanization. The courage of young enslaved people who risked everything to claim dignity in a system designed to deny it deserves recognition and remembrance. Daily resistance manifested in countless small acts that asserted humanity against the machinery of oppression. Work slowdowns, feigned illness, accidental damage to tools or property, and deliberate misunderstanding of orders allowed enslaved people to exercise agency within severe constraints. Young boys developed sophisticated strategies for avoiding the worst abuses, learning to anticipate dangerous moods, creating networks of mutual protection, and finding spaces of relative safety within households or work sites. These survival strategies required intelligence, courage, and solidarity that the slave system claimed enslaved people lacked. Escape attempts, despite severe penalties, occurred regularly throughout the empire. Young boys sometimes had advantages in flight. Their size allowed them to hide in spaces adults couldn't access, and their youth might evoke sympathy from those who might otherwise report fugitives. The countryside around Rome was dotted with communities of escaped slaves who formed bands for mutual protection, though life as a fugitive meant constant danger from slave catchers, starvation, and the elements. Those recaptured faced branding, mutilation, or death as examples to others. The great slave rebellions that periodically convulsed the empire included young participants whose involvement has been largely overlooked by traditional histories. The 3 servile wars in Sicily saw enslaved youth fighting alongside adults, learning military tactics and experiencing brief tastes of freedom before brutal suppression. These rebellions created temporary spaces where enslaved children could glimpse alternative futures, even as they faced the violence of both rebellion and its suppression. Spartacus's rebellion, the most famous slave uprising, included young fighters among its 120,000 participants. Boys served as messengers, scouts, and fighters in the rebel army that defeated multiple Roman legions before its ultimate destruction. The rebellion created a 2-year period where normal power structures inverted and enslaved people controlled significant territory. For young participants, this experience of martial equality and communal decision-making provided models of human dignity that must have sustained hope even after the rebellion's crushing defeat. Cultural resistance preserved identity and dignity despite attempts at erasure. Enslaved boys maintained connections to their origins through language, stories, and customs passed down in secret. They created new cultures that blended elements from diverse backgrounds, forging communities of resistance within the slave system. Songs, stories, and rituals preserved in enslaved communities provided young people with alternatives to the dominant narrative that portrayed them as natural slaves. Suicide represented the ultimate form of resistance, a final assertion of control over one's own body in a system that claimed total ownership. Young enslaved people who chose death over continued exploitation made profound statements about the unbearable nature of their conditions. Roman sources treated such suicides as property damage rather than human tragedy, revealing the moral blindness that slavery required. Yet these acts of self-determination challenged the fundamental premise of slavery, that one human could wholly own another. Legal resistance, though limited, occasionally provided avenues for challenging the worst abuses. Some enslaved people managed to bring complaints to magistrates, particularly in cases where masters violated even the minimal protections Roman law theoretically provided. Young boys who had been illegally enslaved, such as freeborn children kidnapped and sold, might find advocates among free relatives or sympathetic citizens. These cases, while rare, created precedents that revealed the system's inherent contradictions. The long-term impact of resistance shaped Roman society in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. The constant threat of rebellion required massive military resources, elaborate security measures, and psychological energy that diverted Roman attention from other pursuits. The fear of servile uprising haunted Roman consciousness, appearing in literature, law, and daily practice. Young enslaved people who participated in resistance, whether through dramatic rebellion or quiet defiance, forced their oppressors to acknowledge, however indirectly, their fundamental humanity. Their courage in the face of overwhelming power stands as testimony to the indomitability of the human spirit, even in history's darkest chapters. The Roman legal system created elaborate frameworks to justify and regulate slavery, transforming human bondage into a cornerstone of jurisprudence that influenced Western law for millennia. Philosophers and jurists developed sophisticated arguments to naturalize slavery, creating intellectual structures that made the ownership of human beings, including children, appear rational and even moral. These legal and philosophical justifications reveal how societies construct elaborate ideologies to support systems of oppression, and how intellectual authority can be marshaled to defend the indefensible. Roman law evolved complex distinctions regarding enslaved people that simultaneously recognized and denied their humanity. The concept of persona split between free persons who possessed legal personality and enslaved people who existed as res mancipi, property requiring formal transfer procedures. Yet the law also acknowledged enslaved people as human in certain contexts. They could be witnesses in specific circumstances, could be held responsible for crimes, and their testimony under torture was admissible in court. These contradictions created a legal maze where young enslaved boys existed in multiple categories simultaneously: property, potential criminal, occasional witness, but never fully human. The principle of dominica potestas granted masters absolute power over their enslaved property, including the right of life and death. This power extended to all aspects of existence. Masters could determine work, punishment, sexual use, and even whether enslaved people could form relationships or have children. For young boys, this absolute authority meant that no aspect of their lives, bodies, or futures remained under their own control. The law provided no minimum age for enslavement, no protections against sexual abuse, and no limits on physical punishment short of death. And even killing enslaved people faced only minimal legal consequences. Philosophical justifications for slavery drew on various intellectual traditions that converged to normalize bondage. Aristotle's concept of natural slavery, which argued that some people were born to be enslaved, provided intellectual cover for Roman practices. Stoic philosophers, despite their emphasis on universal human dignity, developed accommodations that allowed slavery to coexist with their ethical systems. They argued that true freedom was internal, that external bondage did not affect the soul, effectively telling enslaved people to accept their physical oppression while seeking spiritual liberation. The development of legal procedures around slavery created a vast bureaucratic apparatus that made bondage appear orderly and legitimate. Contracts of sale, records of ownership, procedures for manumission, all created paperwork that transformed human beings into legal objects. Young boys entered this system through documents that recorded their prices, physical descriptions, and supposed origins, reducing human children to inventory items. The precision of these legal instruments masked the violence they authorized and facilitated. Religious and mythological justifications supplemented legal arguments, with stories of divine punishment or cursed lineages explaining why certain people deserved enslavement. The idea that slavery resulted from moral failings, either of the enslaved individual or their ancestors, allowed Romans to view bondage as justice rather than oppression. Young enslaved boys were taught these narratives, encouraged to internalize blame for their own oppression, adding psychological violence to physical bondage. Educational practices reinforced slavery's normalization, with Roman children learning to see enslaved people as natural parts of their world. Free boys studied texts that casually mentioned slavery, learned to give orders to enslaved attendants, and absorbed attitudes that prepared them to become slave owners themselves. Meanwhile, enslaved boys receiving education did so entirely to increase their value to masters. They're learning another form of property enhancement rather than personal development. Legal reforms over time revealed changing attitudes while maintaining fundamental structures of oppression. The Lex Alia Sentia established minimum ages for manumission. The Lex Petronia restricted the use of enslaved people in fatal arena games, and various imperial edicts limited masters' worst excesses. Yet these reforms, often portrayed as humanitarian advances, actually served to preserve the slave system by making it appear more regulated and therefore more legitimate. They addressed extreme abuses while leaving the basic structure of human ownership intact. The contradiction between Roman law's treatment of enslaved people as property and the obvious reality of their humanity created constant tensions that required elaborate intellectual gymnastics to resolve. Jurists debated whether enslaved women's children belonged to the mother's master or the father's, whether enslaved people could truly own property in their peculium, and how to handle situations where enslaved people displayed obvious intelligence, virtue, or capability that challenged assumptions about their natural inferiority. These debates, conducted in abstract legal language, had real consequences for young boys whose futures depended on juristic interpretations of their fundamental nature. The possibility of manumission, formal release from slavery, created complex dynamics within Roman society that affected enslaved youth profoundly. This prospect of potential freedom served as both hope and control mechanism, encouraging compliance while maintaining the fundamental structures of oppression. For young enslaved boys, the promise of eventual manumission shaped their entire experience of bondage, influencing their choices, relationships, and sense of self in ways that revealed both slavery's cruelty and its insidious psychological sophistication. Manumission took various forms, each with different implications for formerly enslaved people. Manumissio vindicta involved a formal ceremony before a magistrate. Manumissio censu recorded freedom in the census, and Manumissio testamento granted freedom through a master's will. Each method created different levels of freedom and social status, with some forms granting full citizenship while others left formerly enslaved people in liminal states. Young boys manumitted through different processes faced vastly different futures, their childhood bondage following them into theoretical freedom. The motivations behind manumission varied considerably and rarely stemmed from humanitarian impulses. Masters freed enslaved people to avoid support costs in old age, to gain credit for generosity, to secure loyal clients, or to benefit from the payments enslaved people made to purchase their freedom. Sexual relationships between masters and enslaved boys sometimes led to manumission, though freedom granted in such contexts came weighted with continued exploitation and social stigma. The transactional nature of most manumissions revealed how freedom itself became commodified within the slave system. Age restrictions on manumission particularly affected young enslaved people. The lex alia sentia established that enslaved people under 30 could only be freed through vindicta and with demonstrated cause, while masters under 20 faced additional restrictions. These laws meant that boys enslaved in childhood might spend decades in bondage, even with masters willing to free them. The psychological impact of knowing freedom was legally impossible for years or decades, created particular forms of despair and resignation. Freedmen, or liberti, occupied a complex social position that revealed the lasting impact of enslavement. Though legally free, they remained bound to former masters through the patron-client relationship, owing obsequium, deference, opere, labor obligations, and sometimes sexual services. Young men freed after childhoods in slavery found themselves navigating a social world that simultaneously recognized their freedom and constantly reminded them of their enslaved past. The stigma of slavery followed them throughout their lives, affecting marriage prospects, career opportunities, and social relationships. The children of freedmen, though born free, faced ongoing discrimination that revealed how deeply slavery scarred family lines. These freeborn children of formerly enslaved parents occupied an intermediate status, neither fully enslaved nor fully free in social terms. Boys born to freed parents carried the invisible marks of their parents' bondage, facing exclusion from certain positions, marriages, and social circles. The multi-generational impact of slavery thus extended far beyond individual manumission. Economic challenges facing newly freed young people often perpetuated conditions resembling slavery. Without resources, education beyond what served their masters, or social networks outside the enslaved community, many freedmen found themselves in desperate circumstances. Young men freed in adolescence or early adulthood might have spent their entire childhoods learning skills valuable only within slavery, leaving them unprepared for free life. Many became dependent on former masters for employment, housing, and basic survival, creating freedom that existed more in law than reality. The psychological impact of manumission on those freed in youth created complex trauma patterns that modern psychology is only beginning to understand. The transition from absolute powerlessness to theoretical autonomy, the need to construct identity beyond property status, and the challenge of forming relationships outside the framework of ownership created profound disorientation. Young people freed after childhoods in slavery often struggled with decision-making, self-worth, and trust, carrying psychological chains long after physical ones were removed. The rare cases of enslaved people achieving significant success after manumission, becoming wealthy merchants, influential artists, or even achieving political power, served to legitimize the system rather than challenge it. These exceptional stories allowed Romans to argue that slavery was not inherently oppressive, since some formerly enslaved people prospered. The pressure on freed youth to succeed, to prove themselves worthy of freedom, created additional burdens that revealed how manumission could extend, rather than end, slavery's psychological control. The promise of freedom, whether achieved or not, thus became another tool in slavery's arsenal, offering just enough hope to prevent complete despair while maintaining the fundamental structures that allowed some humans to own others. The Roman slave system's collapse came not from moral awakening, but from economic and military transformations that made mass slavery unsustainable. As the empire ceased expanding, the supply of war captives diminished. The rise of Christianity, despite its initial accommodation of slavery, gradually introduced ideas that would eventually challenge human bondage. The transition to serfdom in the medieval period represented not liberation, but transformation, as slavery evolved into new forms of oppression. Young boys who might have been enslaved in classical Rome became serfs in medieval Europe, bound to land rather than individuals, but still fundamentally unfree. The influence of Roman slavery on subsequent legal systems proved enduringly destructive. Roman law's treatment of enslaved people as property provided templates for later slave societies, from medieval Europe through colonial Americas. The sophisticated legal frameworks Rome developed to manage human property were studied, adapted, and implemented by later enslavers who found in Roman precedent justification for their own atrocities. The intellectual legacy of Roman slavery thus perpetuated suffering across centuries and continents. Archaeological evidence continues to reveal the extent and intimacy of Roman slavery, particularly regarding young victims. Excavations of slave quarters show cramped conditions, chains and punishment implements sized for children. Burial sites reveal the physical toll of child slavery. Skeletons showing malnutrition, repetitive stress injuries, and evidence of violence. These material remains provide testimony that written sources produced by the enslaving class often obscure or minimize. Each discovered artifact adds to our understanding of individual suffering within the vast system of Roman slavery. Modern historical methods have begun recovering the experiences of enslaved youth through innovative approaches. Analysis of graffiti, study of naming patterns, examination of religious practices, and careful reading of elite sources against the grain reveal glimpses of enslaved children's lives, thoughts, and resistance. Digital humanities projects now attempt to reconstruct networks of enslaved families, trace the origins of captive children, and quantify the scale of child enslavement. These efforts, while necessarily incomplete, honor the humanity of those the Romans attempted to reduce to property. The question of how to remember and teach about Roman slavery raises challenging ethical and pedagogical issues. The tendency to romanticize Rome, to focus on its achievements while minimizing its atrocities, perpetuates historical violence. Yet graphic descriptions of abuse, particularly involving children, raise concerns about exploitation even in educational contexts. Finding ways to convey the full horror of Roman slavery while respecting the dignity of its victims requires careful consideration of language, framing, and purpose. Contemporary relevance emerges as we recognize that modern slavery, including child trafficking and forced labor, continues to plague our world. The mechanisms of dehumanization, The legal and economic structures that enable exploitation and the intellectual justifications for oppression that Rome perfected persist in evolved forms. Understanding how one of history's most celebrated civilizations normalized the ownership and abuse of children provides insights into contemporary systems of exploitation that hide behind legal frameworks and economic necessity. The voices of enslaved Roman youth remain largely silent in the historical record, filtered through the writings of their oppressors or lost entirely. Yet, their suffering shaped the empire in ways historians are still discovering. The labor of enslaved children built Roman monuments, their bodies satisfied Roman appetites, their lives were consumed to maintain Roman comfort. Acknowledging this reality does not diminish Rome's historical significance, but completes it, revealing the full cost of what has been called civilization. The ethical imperative to remember enslaved children extends beyond historical accuracy to moral necessity. These young victims of systematic oppression deserve recognition not as statistics or examples, but as individuals whose lives mattered. Each boy enslaved in Rome had a name, a story, hopes that were crushed, and dignity that survived despite everything done to destroy it. In remembering them, we affirm that no achievement, no matter how grand, justifies the systematic destruction of human lives, particularly those of society's most vulnerable members. Their shadows stretch across history, demanding not just acknowledgement, but a commitment to never again allow such systematic cruelty to be normalized, legalized, or celebrated as the foundation of civilization.